you can know that, get that reassurance from that. But where I'm going to start actually is by saying a little bit about how we came about. And actually, I'm not going to do that. I've got a short video that I'm going to show you, which was made by Fiona, who's Dan's mum, who founded the foundation a few years ago. And she will really tell you a bit more on why this stuff really matters.
I'm Fiona Spargo-Mabs. I'm the director and founder of the Daniel Spargo-Mabs Foundation, which is a drug education charity my husband Tim and I set up when our son Dan died when he was 16, taking MDMA, ecstasy. Let me tell you about Dan. Dan was my bright, big-hearted, funny, kind, chatty younger son. Everyone loved Dan, in school and out. You couldn't help yourself. It could be so annoying, but he was annoying in the most funny, endearing kind of way. He just loved being friends with everyone, and he was really good at making friends with everyone. He was overwhelmingly voted prom king at the end of his year 11, which is basically a popularity test. He'd gone into sixth form at school and he was doing really well. Best ever parents' evening. He'd been in the school production, The Wiz, just before Christmas. He'd signed up as a bone marrow donor. He'd been going out with his lovely girlfriend Jenna for more than 2 years. He was in a really good place. Got to January, he came home from school on a Friday and asked if it was okay to go to a party that evening. So I asked all those usual questions about where would it be and when would he be back and who'd be there. And there were things about it that were a bit unusual. So we had a little bit of to and fro about this party and whether it was or wasn't okay. But in the end, I said yes. And it turned out it wasn't a party. It wasn't where he said it was. It wasn't who he said he'd be with. It was an illegal rave, miles from our home. It was mostly boys from another school, friends of a new friend of Dan's, who'd joined the school for sixth form, who'd got this plan to go to this rave and a plan that some of them would take MDMA, which I'd never heard of. I'd heard of ecstasy, and now I know MDMA is the chemical in ecstasy, but comes in crystal form. So there were 8 boys, 5 of them taking MDMA. One of them was Dan. Apparently, they all dissolved their MDMA in water. According to Dan's friend Jack, who was one of the 3 that wasn't taking anything, and my only source of information, the other 4 boys sipped theirs all the way there to the rave, which took them hours. And Jack said all the way there he could see Dan was holding his back, watching the others, just being a bit wary and hesitant. And Jack didn't say anything because he didn't want to draw attention to it in case Dan wanted to sneak it away. But on that very last train, someone else spotted him holding on to his and said, "Are you not having that then?" And Dan had it. He was fine for a couple of hours, but then he collapsed. He was rushed to hospital. We had the police knocking at our door, raced there as quickly as we could, and spent the next 2 days in intensive care watching Dan die from multiple organ failure. What did it for Dan was the fact the little bag of MDMA he got turned out to be 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past. One of the risks with illegal drugs, that unknown quantity, no way of telling by looking. After Dan died, we learned this wasn't the first time, but it was only the 3rd time. It turned out he'd been on a very short journey when it came to drugs, just a few months. So Dan was friends with literally everyone, every friendship group, and that included a group for whom drug taking had become quite a normal thing. A friend had given him a little of her MDMA to try at a gig a couple of months before he died. And then at another gig, a bit later, she got him and another friend some of their own from her dealer. Now, that hadn't been a good experience for Dan or for her, and we could see from the text on his phone this had really shaken him. And then there's this rave, and he was clearly being really wary about going at all, coming out with lots of excuses, some of them very random and not true at all, but he was persuaded by this friend over a long text exchange, and apparently everyone had been on at him to go. It had been the talk of the whole sixth form common room that day. Everything was more fun when Dan was there, and he was perfectly capable of saying no. So there must have been a bit of him that was persuadable. And of course, nobody meant him to come to any harm, but he did. As parents, we didn't feel we were ignorant about drugs. We'd even been on a 6-week course for parents about young people and drugs, but when the boys were a bit younger. And we'd had conversations at home about drugs, some specifically about ecstasy. As I said, Dan was endlessly chatty and curious about everything and always wanted to know what you thought about everything. But I just didn't know enough, and neither did Dan, to make sure that he could stay safe. And that's why we started this charity, to make sure other young people and their parents were better armed than we had been. We knew we needed to do absolutely everything we could to prevent any harm of any sort happening to anyone else's child. I do realise I represent every parent's worst nightmare, and I always want to reassure people that there are very few of us, thankfully. It doesn't often go quite this badly wrong. But drugs and alcohol can and do cause all sorts of shades of harm and damage, and they're all totally avoidable. So for parents, it's about empowerment, not nightmares, helping them to help their children to make safer choices about drugs.
So that's Fiona. That's the story of how the charity came about. And I'm sure you're getting the sense from hearing Fiona talk about her son is that he wasn't the kind of person that anybody thought any harm would come to because of drugs or alcohol. He was smart, he was popular, endlessly kind of curious. He was doing really well at school, going from GCSEs to A-levels. That jump from 9 or 10 subjects into 3 had really suited him. He was in a long-term relationship, part of his church community, been in a relationship for a couple of years. He really had everything going for him. And you can't profile who is going to come to harm from drugs or alcohol. There are so many different shades of harm, as Fiona says. That's why this stuff really, really matters. One thing that we always say when we're working with students is that we're not there to tell them what to do. We're there to give them information so they feel equipped and develop the skills to make the choices that will keep them as safe as possible when they're in those situations. So here, I'm going to start here with a question for you, and I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are. So do put it in the chat. Don't worry, only I will be able to see it. Who do you think young people go to for information or advice about alcohol and drugs? Or where do you think they go? Who would they turn to? What do you think? Put your thoughts into the chat, and I can see what you think. I'll just wait for a few more to come through, otherwise I do feel like I'm leading people if I say too quickly. Got a couple of answers coming through. So a few people saying peers or friends, close friends, people saying older friends maybe, or websites, Google. Hopefully us as parents, says someone, myself. And a couple of you have actually got it right, because friends is always the most popular answer that people give. But actually, the answer that most give, and this is from this NHS digital survey that you can see at the bottom of this page. It's usually done every 2 years. It was 3 years this time because of COVID. It's a really big piece of work. So on this occasion, they did this big anonymous survey, lots and lots of questions. It's done through schools, and it was nearly 10,000 young people aged 11 to 15, asking a whole range of questions, but one of them was this: who would you turn to, or who would you ask, or where would you go? And over 3/4 said that when it came to alcohol, they would consult their parents, and then it's teachers at 62%, and then the TV, internet, you can see they're around 57%, and then social media. Friends are actually quite a lot lower, kind of half, almost half what it is for parents, and then other adults at school. So it really shows that the adults who they turn to, they respect in their lives, they are definitely the ones that they're looking to for these kind of big, important questions. When it comes to drugs, it's a very similar picture. You can see their parents at 70%, teachers is the second most, and then the internet, TV, social media, friends, and other relatives came through for drugs as well. So thank you very much for participating in that little bit of interaction there. It's really helpful to know what you're thinking. You have much more of an influence on your children than perhaps you're giving yourselves credit for. So thank you again for being with us this evening, because it's really important that you're informed as well. Now, where I'm going to start from here is really just by establishing what drugs are. Now, they are substances that change chemical reactions in the brain and the body. And these chemical reactions are going on all the time. These things you might have heard of, like adrenaline and serotonin and dopamine and so on, all of these kind of things. By disrupting some of these chemical pathways, it changes loads of things about us. So it changes how we feel physically. We might feel more alert or more sleepy, for example. Maybe our breathing or our heart rate will get faster or slower, but also it affects things under the skin like blood pressure and so on, but also how we're thinking, and that in turn really does have an impact on our behaviour. So what's out there? Well, we don't just rely on external information and external data. We do like to collect our own, because we do go into a lot of schools and colleges. And when we're talking to older students, we will send a survey beforehand, year 11 and upwards, this will apply to. And one of the questions we ask on this short survey is, what are the main substances used by people in your year group? Now, this is about perceptions rather than usage, but last year we had over 5,000 responses to this particular question, so it does give us kind of a good baseline for what is around for young people, and it is remarkably similar no matter where we go, no matter how prestigious the kind of elite boarding school, or how gritty the inner city academy, it doesn't matter, it's pretty much the same. Now, the thing that always comes out top is alcohol. That's very unsurprising. It's very easy to get hold of alcohol. It's very normalized within the UK to kind of drink alcohol. So access and kind of normalization do mean that it is very prevalent. Really close behind, though, is vaping. And this is one that we've really seen rise through the years. And it's one that we get asked a lot about in terms of talking to students about when schools do contact us and ask us to go in and work with their students. Now, the things that come up behind that are smoking and cannabis. And wherever we go, it's pretty much always these four in the top 4 spots, and usually in that order. It's quite a drop now, but still a significant number, you know, around a quarter, saying that things like ketamine, nitrous oxide around for them and their peers. Then the numbers do start getting a little bit smaller, but still, you know, quite significant. So we've got ecstasy there, cocaine, magic mushrooms, LSD, Xanax, steroids, and other. Now, other is always a very interesting category because we do ask them to say what they mean. Now, there's a fair amount of I don't know, but there's also a fair amount of people putting names that they haven't ticked further up the list. So, for example, they might write donkey dust, but they haven't ticked ketamine, or canisters, they've not ticked nitrous oxide, that kind of thing. And of course, we do come across some other substances in this category as well. Now, that whole thing around street names and different names for things, it's a very potent one because drugs are known by a whole host of different names, and it's actually a really common source of confusion, particularly for young people, but also us as parents and carers. So some of those names are quite obvious because it's related to the plant or to the chemical, things like cannabis or MDMA. Some of it's around the presentation. So nitrous oxide is sometimes referred to as balloons because the gas gets taken out of those canisters and put into balloons and people inhale it. Some of it's around perceived effects like ecstasy. Some of it's around appearance, things like pills, but there's also a whole host of street names, things like Molly and Mandy, that kind of thing. And some of those are used interchangeably as well. So one thing that we do always stress is how important it is to know what you're getting yourself into, and you don't want to come unstuck just because you've made a mistake with the name, or even the person who's talking to you has made a mistake with the name as well. So how do these things work? Well, they fall broadly into 4 different categories. The first one is the stimulant group. These do what the name suggests. They boost a whole load of body functions. So things like breathing and heart rate will get faster, but also people will normally get a boost in energy, and sometimes, not always, a bit of a lift in mood. It does depend which chemicals are being affected. Now, there's lots of things within this group, and caffeine is a really common example of a stimulant. Not all drugs are illegal. I'm sure some of you, you know, like your coffee or cup of tea if you're feeling a bit of a slump during the day or first thing in the morning even, and you are trying to harness that stimulant effect because you want to have that bit of lift in your energy level. We've also got nicotine in this group, and nicotine's the drug that's in smoking and tobacco products like cigarettes, but also in most legal vapes. There are some that are nicotine free, but for the most part they do contain nicotine. Moving on to illegal stuff, we've got ecstasy here. MDMA is the chemical name. It stands for a very long name that ends in amphetamine. And we've also got cocaine and steroids in this group. Now, too much of any drug is always going to be problematic, and it can indeed be fatal, as indeed was the case for poor Dan there. Now, Dan had an accidental overdose of ecstasy, and I'll talk about how that happened a little later on. But an overdose is one reason why someone might have a strong reaction. Another is an interaction. So something else in your system, which could be alcohol or another drug or medication, over-the-counter remedy, even some food and drinks can interact with some drugs. So that could mean that there is more that is available to the body, so someone would have a stronger kind of effect. The other reason is that if someone has an underlying risk factor that puts them at increased risk. So someone who has a heart condition, for example, that acceleration in heart rate is going to be more problematic for them than it would be for other people sometimes. So lots of factors beyond just what the drug is and the amount even. Now, a group that on the face of it is the opposite to the stimulant group is the depressant group. And that's because it really does slow a lot of things down. Things like breathing and heart rate will slow down, but also brain functioning. So people can feel really quite drowsy. Now, there's lots of things within this group. Alcohol's a really common example. People, fall asleep or pass out if they've had too much to drink, and that depressant action is why. We've also got cannabis in this group, and cannabis comes in lots of different forms, as so many drugs do, and it does matter the form that someone takes a drug in. Now, if you are smoking or inhaling or snorting, it gets into your system very quickly, so you feel the effects very quickly. Whereas if you're ingesting, as you would do with an edible, you can see the edible forms of cannabis here, just some of them, but also pills, then it takes a little bit longer to get into your system, sometimes up to 2 hours, because it's got to go through your stomach before it goes into your bloodstream and up to your brain. The effects themselves, they can be quite different because of how it is metabolized through the body, and of course the duration of action can be quite different as well. The final thing in this group is Xanax, which we talk about because it is part of that very important benzodiazepine group, which contains other things that people might be familiar with, like Valium, which is diazepam, and flunitrazepam, which is Rohypnol. Now, Xanax can be, those kind of drugs, they can be problematic in their use directly, but also indirectly, because spiking is a problem. I have been spiked 3 times, once only last week, and it's really unpleasant, that thing where you suddenly realize that you're not feeling in control. It's completely out of whack with what you've had, and you can really feel quite vulnerable as a result of that. It happens to boys as well as girls. It is a criminal offence. It's never big, it's never funny, but it's often the depressants that are used for this because they do make people vulnerable, because it can make them very, very drowsy and mean that they don't think straight in the same way that they would be normally. Now, depressants and stimulants, they don't oppose each other, they don't cancel each other out. Very important to know that. These things will be working through very nuanced different chemical pathways through the brain and the body. And so if someone takes one and then another, the effects of one will dominate, but the effects of the other, they will just be masked, they will still be going on, and all kinds of mixing is always bad. Now, the next group is the hallucinogen group. These are sometimes known as psychedelics, and that's because they alter sensory perception. So something that you're looking at or listening to or even smelling or tasting is likely to be altered from what it would be normally. And that in turn, it affects our thinking. Sometimes consciousness levels can be affected too. Now, there's 2 big names in this group, LSD and magic mushrooms. Again, all of these things are known by just such a wide range of names. But mental state is so important with any kind of drug, but particularly the hallucinogens, because if you're feeling bad in some way, low or angry or depressed or anything like that, really stressed, you're much more likely to have a bad trip, a bad experience, and of course you're in that for the duration of the effect of the drugs in your brain and body. If you're feeling good, you may feel like you're invincible, and that can also be problematic. You can take risks that you wouldn't necessarily take, which can just affect you, can affect other people as well. Now, the final group I want to mention is the dissociative group. These give this sense of out-of-body experience, a bit of a sense of detachment between the brain and the body. There are 2 big names in this group, nitrous oxide. I'm sure you've seen these little canisters scattered around, but we're also seeing increasingly these big canisters just discarded. Nitrous oxide is quite an interesting drug because it actually works exerts its effects by blocking oxygen getting to some of the brain cells. Brains are amazing, and other brain cells basically will kick in to restore normal functioning, and that's why it feels like the effect wears off very quickly. And it can be really tempting to go again, but the brain cells are being starved of oxygen for longer than you can feel the effects. These big cans, they contain an awfully large amount of nitrous oxide. It's very easy to kind of go in too hard, go to too much, and nitrous oxide has been linked to all kinds of problems, not just people falling over and hurting themselves, but people going into comas, problems with nerve function. You know, there have been fatalities because of nitrous oxide, and it's much more likely the more that someone's done. Now, the final thing I want to mention is ketamine, which is a very profound dissociative. They don't call it horse tranquilizer for nothing. It is actually used for that. Again, it comes in lots and lots of different forms. You can disappear into a K-hole with ketamine, where your brain and your body feel completely detached from each other. And again, that can leave people feeling very vulnerable. It's another thing that can be used for spiking. So lots of drugs, lots of different effects, and lots of different kind of factors within that I've mentioned throughout. All of them will work by putting the brain and the body into an artificial way of being. And so they will need to recover. And that's what the come down is, where people feel very low in mood, very low in energy. Anybody who's had a kind of that kind of sense of fear after drinking too much will be familiar with this. That is the drugs kind of leaving the body, alcohol leaving the body, and just the brain and body just trying to restore themselves, really. So that can happen with anything. It can feel really nasty. It can actually last for much longer than the effects of the drugs themselves. Now, on the night that Dan went out, there were 5 boys who said that they were going to be in, and so one of the boys, he got in touch with the dealer. He got 5 bags of white powder and he gave them out at random. Now, the bag that Dan got, as Fiona mentioned in her story earlier, turned out to be incredibly strong, 12 times stronger than it killed people in the past. And that's why he came to such serious harm. Whoever had got that bag was going to come to harm that night. The other 4 boys were okay, and that seems incongruous because they were from the same batch, they all looked identical, but it's because there's no regulation, no checks and balances around the manufacturing of illegal drugs, as would be the case with things like medicines, for example. These stills are taken from a film, which we will link to in that information leaflet that you can access afterwards. It's definitely worth watching. And they show pills being made. It's in someone's bedroom. It's very dirty. They are using ingredients that they've sourced off the dark web. They don't test them. They don't know what's in them. They do have a balance. They leave half the powder on there. And that carelessness and lack of hygiene does extend through the whole process, including the mixing. And so what comes out of their pill press, it looks like the real deal. Those pills are likely to be very variable in their constituent parts. So some of them are likely to be very strong, and that's what happened with poor old Dan. Some of them could have hardly any active ingredient in them at all, and that's a problem too, because people might think that they've got a very high level of tolerance and they go again, and then the next one could be completely different. And of course, lots of room for problems such as contaminants, adulterants, things put in there deliberately, all kinds of potential issues. And the thing is that we're kind of conditioned to just accept things as being what they are stated to be. People don't usually question it, but they very definitely should. This kind of problem in terms of manufacturing goes for all illegally sourced substances, all illegal substances. Anything can be made to look like anything. It's very tempting to think that things have been diverted from pharmaceutical supply chains and the like, but in reality, that is very, very unlikely. It costs a lot more money to do that, and this is all about profit. The only way to know what you're getting is to get stuff tested. This is another organisation that I do some work for. They're called The Loop, and they do drug testing at some big events like some music festivals. People can hand in a sample of their drugs. They don't get into trouble for doing that. It's all anonymised as well. And The Loop will do some chemical analysis on that substance that they've got. And then someone will sit down with the individual and say, this is what was tested. This is how it would be likely to affect you. It's not perfect because it's just a sample of what they've got, but it's something. And people often will change their behaviour as a result of having that bit of information. It also means that the loop can put out alerts like these on socials, highlighting things that are likely to cause harm, perhaps because they're very strong, perhaps because they're being sold as one thing and actually don't contain it at all. That is surprisingly common. Or maybe where there's different forms of the same product floating around containing different things. And so that whole thing with expectations versus what actually happens, if they're out of kilter, that can be really mess with you kind of mentally as well as physically. So always worth following events on socials for all kinds of reasons, but this is just another. And I've talked quite a lot about drugs in terms of what they do, problems around the manufacturing, and lots of other variables, but that is just one dimension of risk. As people, we're all different ourselves to hour, in terms of how we're feeling physically, mentally, but also we're different to each other. And so that introduces a whole new raft of variables, as does the place that we're in. So two things that can be particularly problematic: someone who's on their own, if something goes wrong, there's nobody there to raise the alarm, but also when people are at a place where there's lots and lots of people, but they don't necessarily know them. So festivals, gigs, parties, that kind of thing, because someone is not going to realise that someone is altered if they don't know them very well. They'll only know when something's going really badly wrong. So that introduces a whole new level of kind of risks as well as the inherent things. You know, is the place actually safe? Is it scary? What's the vibe? There's loads of stuff there. So here's a question for you. I've been talking for quite a long time, so I'm interested to have a little bit of input from you. Again, in the chat, let me know what you think are the two substances that cause the most problems for young people. What do you think? Which two substances do you think cause the most problems for young people? Put it in the chat for me so I can see that. I'll have a little sip of my tea while you do. Got some answers coming through. So I've got a few here. Oh, lots of answers coming through. Thank you very much. It's always so much nicer, so much better when you participate. So what have we got coming through here? So vaping, nitrous oxide, cannabis, alcohol, nitrous oxide, cannabis, alcohol, cannabis mentioned again, cannabis, alcohol, cocaine gets a mention as well, smoking, vaping. Yeah, it's definitely there amongst those things that you said. Alcohol and cannabis are the two that cause the most problems for young people. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of information about each of these. Now, one thing that it's worth talking to teenagers about is the concept of units of alcohol, because alcohol can be quite confusing because there are so many different products out there and they're all different flavors, which is the bit that they usually focus on. But the big thing is, of course, that they're different strengths. So having an understanding of this concept of a unit, which basically is a way that we have of comparing different things, can be really useful for them, because when they start drinking, they're probably not going to be in a bar or pub where things are being measured out for them. It's likely to be informal, where things are being poured or handed round. And so having that sense of what it looks like can be helpful. So show them in a glass how much is a unit in beer or wine or things like whiskey or vodka, because if they have that kind of visual idea, that can be really helpful for them. It's also useful for them to have an understanding of what the recommended limits are. So men and women, adults, are told to not exceed 14 units per week. Now, that isn't about behaviour, that's about the kind of health effects. Do remember, parents are role models, and that can go both ways. And if they're seeing you using alcohol as kind of an emotional crutch, or they're seeing you getting drunk, that can be quite negative. It does normalise that behaviour for them. Equally, if they're seeing you be very responsible with alcohol, alternating it with water, things like that, kind of pacing yourself, that's a really positive thing that you're role modeling for them, and it normalizes that for them. So it can go either way. Now, some age specific things. Children under the age of 15, the recommendation is kind of unequivocal. They should not drink alcohol at all, and that's because there's really clear evidence that it can do quite a lot of damage in terms of the brain and the bones and hormone levels, because they are all changing a lot in that kind of 10 to 15 age group. And also for older children, those who are starting to drive maybe, and also for adults, it's worth knowing that it takes an hour for the liver to process every unit of alcohol, and the first hour doesn't count because it takes a while for that system to get going, for the alcohol to get where it needs to go. So Having an understanding of units means that people can then work out when it's out of their system and they're okay to drive, or maybe someone who's driving them, they can work that out for them on their behalf. Now, we also often get asked about where to stand on things like alcohol at parties, because it can be a really difficult one to navigate. So we've put together some tips. Parties should be by invitation only, not a big open invitation, because you do need to have an idea of how many and who's going to be there. And they do need to be supervised, ideally by a team of adults who will be there throughout. If alcohol is being provided for under 18s, as the adult responsible, if it's your home, if something goes wrong, that's on you. So it's worth seeking agreement from the other parents. Long alcoholic drinks are better. Don't forget to put soft drinks, water out as well, and don't put it all out at the beginning. Just, you know, put some out, see how it goes. They may well have sneaked stuff in as well. It's worth providing food, because putting some carbs in them can really help matters, and it also gives you an excuse to circulate and see how things are going. Kind of presence of an adult can be quite beneficial in terms of behaviour. Also, talk to your teenager. It's their party too, and they are responsible too, and they also need to know that they can come to you if there's a problem. Now, if your teenager's going to a party, it's worth trying to get in touch with whoever is holding that party in advance and check the kind of arrangements in reverse. I did a Facebook Live this a couple of years ago during one of the lockdowns. We did a whole host of Facebook Lives. So if you are interested in this, there's even more information, tips, advice, that kind of thing on that. So do have a look at that. And I'll be letting you know how you can find those later on. And they're not just on Facebook, don't worry. Now, in terms of cannabis, cannabis has a huge range of effects on people's behaviour, and that's because it actually ties into its own system in our brain. Now, it does this through the effect of two chemicals. The big one is THC. That causes that kind of relaxed, chilled out vibe that people usually refer to as the high, but it can also cause a whole load of negative effects, so things like vomiting, anxiety, paranoia, panic attacks, memory loss, that loss of motivation that can really be so damaging, and actually is the biggest reason why young people try and stop using cannabis. Now, there's also CBD in there as well. Now, CBD doesn't cause any of those effects, and it does seem to have some interesting health benefits. But CBD is very important because it kind of balances out some of the harm that can be done by the THC. Now, the problem that we have in the UK is that street cannabis has become incredibly strong, and you can see a graph there that shows how it has changed. The cannabis that's out there now, it has a very, very high level of THC and very little CBD in it. So people are definitely getting high, but because there's not very much CBD in there to kind of balance things out, smooth out those effects, we're seeing many more negative impacts of cannabis than we ever have done. And this isn't a trend that's going to reverse anytime soon. We're seeing much higher levels of dependency because it is so strong. 1 in 6 who smokes cannabis, and nobody thinks if I smoke a bit of weed, they're going to get hooked. But that is exactly what happens. And of course, those who are using cannabis more regularly, they are much more likely to get dependent on it. And it is the biggest reason why young people seek help for their drug use. For adults, it's things like painkillers and alcohol. But for young people, the biggest reason by far is actually cannabis. And it's very normalised. We hear a lot, oh, it's just a bit of weed, miss. There's also a very kind of strong link with mental health problems. So using cannabis is a very big risk factor for developing things like anxiety and depression and schizophrenia. And you can just see that reflected in this graph here, that mental and behavioural disorders causing accident and emergency admissions. You can see how it's really increasing, and that kind of is in line with cannabis getting stronger and stronger. There's also a very strong link with psychosis. 1 in 3 cases of psychosis is linked to cannabis use. And it's always in London, around this area, it is much more potent. Everything in capitals is always kind of bigger and more and stronger, sadly. Now, in terms of edibles, we do hear about them more and more. The way that they're produced is different to how kind of weed is produced, and so because of that, the levels of THC that it contains are very unpredictable. They also can be laced with other things, and we've come across some cases recently where they've been laced with synthetic cannabinoids, which you probably have heard of under the name Spice. It looks very similar on paper, but in practice it's a very, very different drug in terms of its effects. Now, the other big problem with edibles is that because they go through the gastrointestinal system, it takes a long time for them to kick in. And by the time they do, can be up to a couple of hours, you can't do anything about it, you're all in. You can't do anything in terms of reducing the intake or getting rid of it. People think that they can vomit and stuff, but it's already gone through into the system. So, and the effects can really be quite severe. It is also a Class B drug, which we do mention because there's a commonly held misconception that the police don't really care about a bit of weed. But in many parts of the UK, the vast majority of parts of the UK, they have not said that they don't care. And London and the surrounding areas is definitely part of that. Now, that takes me on to the law and some terms you've probably heard of: possession and production and supply. Just to mention also for import and export, going on holiday, you do need to be really careful, even with kind of prescription medication and things like that. Now, the penalties do depend on what type of drug it is, how much you've been caught with, if it's a first offence, but also whether it is possession versus production or supply, because possession is about harm to yourself, whereas production and supply are about harm to others. Now, some parent-specific information: if you take drugs from your child, you must destroy them or hand them to the police really quickly, because otherwise, effectively, you're in possession of those drugs, and that's a criminal offence for you. It is also an offence to allow drug use in your home. Now, in terms of supply, any form of supply, any form of drugs changing hands is classed as supply in the eyes of the law. And it's really common, this concept of social supply, and Ruth will talk a little bit more about that later. If things go wrong, someone is much more likely to be caught. And this is the very sad case of Carson Price, who passed away a couple of years ago. He took ecstasy willingly, knowingly. He was only 13 at the time. And his classmate had got it from a dealer and given it to him. And he'd taken it himself as well. But they didn't get anybody further up the chain. And so that classmate of his was actually sentenced as a dealer. And that means that loads of opportunities in his life will be taken away from him because he has that on his police record. That's a really serious offence. There's lots of other offences as well, of course, things like drink and drug driving, antisocial behaviour, also consent issues as well, around sex and so on. And just having any kind of criminal record, as I say, it does have long-term consequences for things that people take for granted as being in their future. Going to university, getting a job. There are some jobs you can't have at all with a drugs offence, even going on holiday. So, you know, it's definitely worth kind of keeping your nose clean when it comes to the law. Now, just a reminder, we have got some time for questions at the end, so do put them in the Q&A section anonymously if you would like to. I've really done a whistle-stop tour through lots of stuff, including 2 specific substances, but there is lots of information about different substances, a much wider range of substances and related topics in the video section of our Facebook page, but also on our website. So if you are interested in anything in particular, maybe you want to know more about nitrous oxide or cocaine or something like that, then, you know, by all means go there. It's a good way to get lots of information really quickly. But I'm going to hand over to Ruth now, and she's going to take you through the next part of this workshop.
Hi everybody, hello. Yeah, that was a whistle-stop tour, and I'm afraid my bit is going to be a whistle-stop tour as well. What we're going to be looking at is things to do with choice, helping our children to make safe choices, risk, how we can help children to reduce or mitigate the risk of using drugs and alcohol, and what role the teenage brain plays in that. So I am just about to share my screen now so that we can have a look and see how all of that works. Okay, so initially, let me just get rid of that because it's going to drive me nuts. There we are. Initially, we're just thinking about the reasons why people make the choices. And this is just a quote about, you know, there are reasons for everything that we do, but we don't necessarily know what those reasons are. We haven't always sort of thought about it clearly. And what I want to help you with now is to try and help you to help your children with how that works. So we're doing a little poll now, which I will put up. And the first question is, what percentage of 15-year-olds had been offered and had taken illegal drugs. So if you would just like to answer that for me now, I'll launch it and then you can put the answers in and we'll have a look and see what you think. You just click on the numbers that you think are most likely. So yeah, I've got some 60 to 80% to start off with. Some saying 20 to 40% maybe of young people say that they've been offered them and have possibly taken them. But this is the offering first of all. So let's try that. Okay, so we're on about, yeah, the majority of you think about 40 to 60% of children have been offered them. And then some think 60 to 80% and rather fewer think 20 to 40%. So let's have a look now at, right, the second part of it, which is who tried it. And again, 20 to 40% is sort of the biggest number that's come up. The next biggest one is 0 to 20, and a few think that as many as 60 to 80% of 15-year-olds have actually tried illegal drugs. So let's have a look now at, there's the results, by the way, just for you to have a quick look at. That was question 1, as I sort of told you about, and then this is question 2 here as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that now, and we will have a look at what the results of that were. So let's move this on. Okay, who said they tried them? So what we're trying to look at now is the drugs and the decisions. So this is from this same survey that Asha was talking about, the NHS digital one, and we've got the most recent results are from 2021. So when you're looking at 11-year-olds, which is very young, still, you know, 12%, it's quite a lot of children who've been offered them, and even so 6% have tried them. But by the time you get into 15-year-olds, you're looking at just over half of them have been offered them and 32% have tried them, so almost a third. So that's a rather bigger group. And you can see from that little table there how those numbers have fluctuated over the years. But you can see that steadily the number who've tried has increased. Slight drop from 2018 to 2021. That could be to do with the pandemic, because actually children haven't been as able to get together and you know, share drugs with each other. And similarly, you know, with the offered as well, you know, slightly fewer in 2021, presumably for a similar reason. So who did they get them from? Mainly from friends. Again, slightly fewer, a slightly smaller percentage, just under half as opposed to over half than in 2018, but more from a dealer in the 2021 survey, which is also probably to do with the pandemic, because they can get them online from a dealer. So physically, where did they get them? Well, the majority, the same in both the last 2 surveys, somewhere around a half, just a bit more, a bit less. Similarly, again, at somebody else's house, they've gone to a friend's house and the friend has got them. About 15% at home, which is quite interesting, 12% at a party, and 5% at school. Now, again, that number is lower than it was in 2018, but probably again because of the pandemic. Something that we're noticing, that we're seeing increasingly now, and something that Fiona has done a piece of work on with the BBC and with social media companies, is how many young people are seeing adverts for drugs on sale through social media, and how many had bought drugs through social media. So, you know, about 1 in 3, about a third of those who had bought drugs had bought them from a social media site, and this is comparatively new. So there's another poll now about what do young people say is the reason that they used drugs on the first occasion that they did so. So let me just launch that poll now. Hold on, sorry, that's the first one. Let me give you the second one. Here we go. There we are. And if I launch that now, then you can see what the questions are and you can answer them. So my friends were doing it. boredom, curiosity, to forget my problems because it's cool, because it was offered. And you just need to scroll down a little bit because there's because they wanted to get high as well. So that's on there. If you could just fill those answers in. Yeah, okay, so initially quite a lot of people thinking it's because friends are doing it. Curiosity is coming up as well because it was offered. I think, yeah, you just need to scroll up to find the next set of questions so that you've answered all of them. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions in all. So if you just want to have a look at that, wanted to get high was the last one. Okay. Let's have a look at the results are. Let's share the results now. There we are. So most people thought it was because your children's friends were doing it. Curiosity comes in as well. A few people thought that it was, because it was offered, and nobody went for want to get high at the minute. Okay, so let's have a look at what the survey reveals from that. Let's take that out of there. Okay, so here we go. Yeah. Okay, so this again, you've got the ages of the children starting at 11 and running up to 15, and you can see how the numbers generally go up, but then some of them reduce again slightly in older children, and this is because their perception of risk is beginning to improve by then, and I'll explain why that is next time. But you can see that curiosity question, really, I wanted to see what it was like, is the top reason for 15-year-olds to do it, and it's nearly 3/4 by the time when you're looking at 14-year-olds, so it's drops a little bit by the time they're 15. A bit short of half for getting high or feeling good. Rather fewer, I think, than most parents think of that idea that it's because their friends are doing it, maybe because of peer pressure, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well shortly. The boredom factor for the 15-year-olds is quite well reduced, and that may be, again, because by the time they're 15, they're getting to be a bit more independent. There are other things that they can do to entertain themselves. A worrying one I always feel is I just wanted to forget my problems, and you're looking at, about a fifth of 15-year-olds, and more than that, actually, more than a quarter for the 13-year-olds, which is quite worrying. Then some, well, just because it was offered, and a few because it's cool, but not quite so many there. So we're going to move on now and have a look at how the teenage brain impacts, the changes in the teenage brain impact how children make choices and how they assess risk. So it's a really critical period from the age of 10 up to 25, and that surprises a lot of parents that it takes that long. But when your child's brain is changing from a brain that it needs when it's a child to a brain that it's going to need as an adult, there's an awful lot of things to happen. Some connections disappear, other ones are made, and so there's a whole lot of stuff going on. Now, the limbic system, which is the kind of emotional bit of the brain, if you want to think about it like that, this is the bit that starts to change first. And so it makes children very aware of the kind of social and emotional situations that they're in. And so that's why, we sort of moan sometimes and say, oh, the child's full of hormones. And it is that. And it's because of this change to the limbic system. It's where children are becoming very, very attuned to those emotional things that are going on in their lives. And part of the reason for this is because the amount of dopamine, which is a hormone that's very much linked to pleasure and reward. So if we feel good about something, that's because of a release of dopamine. Or if we take a risk that works out, that we get a reward from it, and that also increases the flow of dopamine. And those two things are really closely linked within the structure of the brain. Now, the second bit, the last bit to connect up and to develop and change is the prefrontal cortex. Is the bit I always refer to as the sensible part of your brain. And this is the bit that helps you to make decisions, to organise your life. And many of us who've got or have had teenage children will sort of remember how scatty they were and how, you know, often they forgot their pencil case or their sports kit or whatever it happened to be, those kind of things. And being able to solve problems and think about the result of something that they do. So if I do this, what will happen? They're not very good at thinking about that. And it's this prefrontal cortex development that helps them to do that. It helps them to behave appropriately in social situations so that they know how to behave when they're talking to the headmaster rather than talking to their mates, or how to behave when they're in a religious setting rather than running about on a sports field, that kind of thing. How to have the social interactions that are appropriate to particular circumstances, and being aware of themselves in a way that says, I know how to behave here, rather than behaving in an inappropriate way without knowing that that's what's happening. So during that period from 10 to 25, there can be this mismatch between what's going on in the emotional side of the brain and what's happening in the sensible part of the brain that moderates our behavior. And that can be really important in how children make decisions about things. So I said we do a little bit about peer pressure. So we'll have a look at what the role of peers, of friends, is at this point. Now, between these ages, obviously, this is when children are becoming more independent and moving away from parents and carers as the people to whom they turn naturally, and they start to turn to their friends. So they're spending more time with their friends. And again, because of this development, first of all, of the limbic system, they're much more sort of sensitive to the social reward and the social inclusion and exclusion. It's very important to them to be part of the group. And if you need to do something which is risky in order to be part of the group, they're much more likely to do that. Interestingly, during this phase, if an adolescent is gauging risk on his or her own, they can do it in exactly the same way as an adult can, but they will take more risks when they're with their friends. And obviously they need to be with their friends. It's, you know, we can't wrap them in cotton wool all of their lives. But it does bring them into potential risk when they're trying to make decisions when they're with their friends. Because during this period, it takes them longer to do that thing about saying, if I do this, what will happen or what might happen? They find it very difficult to resist those urges and impulses for things that they want to do, you know, like these young people here who are, you know, cliff jumping, which is very risky. And they're more likely, as we said, to make those risks when they're with their friends, or if they're very sort of hyped up about something, or angry about something, or depressed about something, or they're feeling pressured to do something that they don't want to do. And this risk-taking behaviour is at its greatest between 13 and 16 years old, and then it begins to drop after that. So ways of helping your children to manage that influence of their friends is a really important thing for us as parents to be doing. And we can do that by helping your child and encouraging your child to, you know, have some stalling tactics so that they can put off decisions maybe until they've come home and spoken to you, or just ask themselves in the quietness of their own minds, do I really want to do this? Would I do this if I was on my own? And I think it was one of Dan's friends who came up with two things. Would I do this if I was on my own? And the other question was, would I tell my mum I'm going to do this? And if the answer to either of those questions is no, it's probably not a good idea. And keep reminding your children all the time that most young people don't take drugs or drink too much. You know, that they will come home and say to you, oh, everybody's doing it. You know, you're so mean, you won't let me do it. Remind them that really good research, peer-reviewed research, tells them that, you know, most young people aren't doing drugs or drinking. So again, from a big survey, a YouGov big survey on drugs in 2022, told us that 71% of sort of 16 to 24-year-olds, so older end of that age group had never felt pressured into taking illegal drugs. So, you know, that's 3/4 of young people didn't really feel pressured. 15%, the 15% who did feel pressured, or 15% of those who had felt pressured, didn't take them. And it's a very small number, only 7% really, who took them because they felt pushed into doing it. They felt that peer pressure to do it. You might wonder why we've got a picture of a frog there. And this is just a funny little illustration of how that peer pressure can work. I am not suggesting that anybody should do this, but if you get a frog and put it into a pan of boiling water, it will know that that's what's happening to it and it will try to get out. If you put a frog into a pan of cold water and gradually heat it up, because it's happening gradually, like the pressure from your friends builds up gradually, it doesn't realise what's happening until it's too late to do anything about it. So if you're thinking about peer pressure and how it works, think about the frog, and that might remind you about your child having time and space to understand what's happening to them. But before we get all full of doom and gloom about this, there are protective factors that we can help our children to develop, and there are various of them. Some of them are individual to your child. So encourage your child to eat well, to sleep well, to get enough sleep, even if that sleep is from 1 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock in the morning, which I know doesn't work with school, but that tends to be something that young people need to do during this time of brain development. Help them in whatever way we can to regulate their emotions, to understand what's happening to them. So either by talking things through beforehand, or if they do kick off, when everything's calmed down, talking to them and saying, do you really think, was that really an appropriate way of reacting to that? Do you understand why you did it? And what can we do to help you not respond like that in the future? Helping them with their self-esteem. So not telling them that they're brilliant at absolutely everything, because that gives them completely the wrong idea of themselves, but praising them appropriately, helping them to get involved in things that keep their self-esteem high, help them with problem-solving skills and coping strategies. So talk to them about what they might do in terms of if they feel pressured to do something, having a little range of excuses like, oh, I think my mum said my granddad was coming around tonight, so I'm not sure I can do that. I'll message you, when I've got home and talk to my mum, or something like that. And if you've got an issue that you're thinking about, or they've got an issue that they need to sort out a problem, encourage them to come and talk to you about it and discuss it. Not so that you're going to tell them what to do, but just discuss it with them, and help them to get engaged with things outside home. So it might be after school activities, it might be sporting things, it might be having a job. That's a really good way of helping children to learn about life and how to deal with things. And if you're part of a religious or cultural organisation, then those activities are helpful as well. And then there's family things, all to do with supportive relationships within families. So to do with looking out for each other. And if that's part of your family culture, that's really helpful as a protective factor. Keeping connections with your children, talking to them. And I know that a lot of teenagers go through what was always known in our house as the grunt phase, where whatever you said to them, you got a sort of noise. But if you've had those good relationships before you get to that stage, you'll still have them when they come through it, but try and keep talking to them, making it a positive experience, so that the communications between parents and children are not just arguments about things, but actually enjoying things, laughing about things together, encouraging them to be curious like Dan was, to find out about things. And all families have structures, boundaries, limits, and having those and making sure that the children understand them and know what they are, and understand, more importantly, why you have them, so that they can get on board with them. But as parents, as with teenage children, we also have to be aware that we have to negotiate those and be flexible. They're going to change, the boundaries are going to move and expand as the children get older and more responsible. And just maintain those clear expectations so that they know what is going to be expected of them. And one of the ways that we can do this and help them to build those protective factors is by having conversations with them, talking to them. starting early, 10 or 11 is about right. They're old enough to understand, but they're not likely to have come into contact with too much at the moment. But it's never too late. If you haven't done it, just try and make a start on it. Understand that you don't have to know everything. And sometimes one of the best ways of sort of having these conversations is by finding out together, getting online, going to reliable sources like us, like some other websites that we'll give you later on in the webinar, and finding out about it together. And where there are opportunities, either from things on television or in a film or on in newspapers, or even something that you've heard or read about, just talk to you, bring it up. Or if your child brings it up, involve yourself in the conversation with it. Sometimes it's not always at the most appropriate time, but try it if you can, and make opportunities. And sometimes think about when and where it works best. And I used to find with my kids, if they'd got something that they wanted to talk about that they were a bit uncomfortable about, they would often talk to me about it in the car, because you don't have to make eye contact then. If they're in the back seat and you're driving, they can talk about it without having to see your face and the response. If you don't remember anything else out of this, try and remember to listen and actively listen, rather than listening thinking, oh, this is terrible, or this is what I want to say. Just listen and absorb it and think about it before you respond, because you're more likely to respond appropriately from that. Remind them of those social norms, that most youngsters aren't drinking alcohol and taking drugs, and keep coming back to it. Just as a school curriculum does, it becomes more complex as they get older, but just keep coming back to it. Be prepared for tricky questions, and the trickiest one that mostly comes up is, did you ever do drugs, mum or dad? And I'm not going to tell you how to answer that, but think about it and be prepared. You know your child better than anybody else. And if you fess up to having done a bit of weed or something in your youth, will your child still be listening when you're explaining to them the things that Asha has said about cannabis being much stronger now than it used to be, and its links with mental health and stuff? Because if they've zoned out, what you may have done unintentionally is given them permission to do that, to try something. These top tips from teens are absolutely brilliant. So make drugs and alcohol a normal, comfortable kind of conversation. Try not to respond negatively each time, if they start to say something about, I was offered drugs today or whatever. Don't sort of go, and get all excited about it. Say, oh, crumbs, that's interesting. What did you do? What did you say? How did you feel? That kind of thing. We're always inclined as parents to want to protect our children, but if we catastrophize and sort of hammer at them with all the worst possible things that can happen, they won't talk to us about it anymore. But if we can think about helping them with solutions and discussing it, then that's much more helpful to them. And I think this one is the key one. Let me say everything I need to say. Let me tell you what I'm thinking. Don't jump to conclusions. So keep all those screams in your head, and pause and breathe, and then say something fairly open, like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about what happened? So that they're not thinking that you're just going to jump down their throats all the time. And then they will talk to you again. If it all goes wrong and it ends up in a shouting match, which it might do sometimes because it was the wrong time or the wrong place, or you said the wrong thing or something, don't give up. Wait till it's calmed down. Apologize for it all going wrong, even if it's not entirely always your fault, and come back to it again, because this is really important. Just a few sort of safety strategies now, and I'll go through these quite quickly. Make sure that your child has their in case of emergency contact information on the lock screen of their phone, so that somebody's not faffing about trying to put a PIN number in or something. If it's just there on the lock screen, then somebody can use their own phone then to contact you if there is an emergency. Having an escape plan is always a good idea. So decide what your code is going to be, something probably that your child texts you. If they're feeling uncomfortable in a place and they want to get out without losing face. So decide the code, agree what the response is going to be, which might be then that they look at their phone and then say, oh, I've got to ring my mum, maybe, or you ring them. If they send you the code, you ring them. And then the child can say, you know, make up a sort of, oh, you know, this is really irritating. My mother's locked her keys in the house. She needs me. I need to go home. She's going to come and collect me because I've got keys to get into the house. And then the parent can come and collect them. The child hasn't lost any face. The most difficult one is that last one. Don't bombard them with questions when they get into the car, because if you do, they won't use the system again. They will probably tell you, they might even tell you on the way home in the car, but they will probably tell you later when they've processed it a bit more. But that way helps them to maintain using the escape plan. And if they haven't already got it, encourage them to put the St John Ambulance app on their phone. It's really helpful. And even if your child has done first aid courses and things, in the heat of the moment, if they need to do something to help one of their friends or something, sometimes it just goes out of their heads. But if they can just click on that app, it will tell them how to do CPR, how to put somebody in the recovery position, all of that kind of thing. So when we're thinking about staying safe, you know, do say to your child, the only way to reduce drug-related risk to zero, to absolutely nothing, is not to use them. You know, that's the bottom line. But you're not actually saying don't do it, you're just reminding them of that. And one of the good ways of reminding them of these things is talk to your child about if they're with a friend who is using drugs. Encourage your child to know stuff about harm reduction. So it's about that stuff about starting with a little bit of a drug and wait to see what happens. Don't just, you know, take the whole lot all at once. You know, it's about not mixing things, staying together with a group of friends and check in from time to time, because if it's a friend that you know well, you will know if they're behaving peculiarly or looking unwell, whereas, as Asha said, strangers won't. Definitely don't mix things. So if you've decided you're going to do MDMA or something, don't drink alcohol as well. If you're somewhere where you can get it tested, do so. Again, start low, go slow. More isn't necessarily better. If your child's going to be, if their friend is going to be drinking alcohol, then it's a good idea for your friend to encourage them to eat something beforehand, because we know that that helps with the take-up of the alcohol, slowing the taking up of the alcohol. But there are some things where actually it's better not to eat beforehand. So if your child has some knowledge about that, they can tell their friends that if they're taking certain things, don't eat beforehand because it might make you sick. Think about those risk factors, that drug, person and place that Asha mentioned. So talk to your children about that, and talk about, you know, how some things can affect their friends' mental states. And again, if you don't remember anything else, do encourage your child not to be afraid to call 999 if somebody needs an ambulance, because if you call it soon enough, then, you know, they can be helped. But sometimes young people are afraid that that will get them into trouble because it's a drug-related thing. The ambulance crew will deal with what is in front of them. They're not going to judge. They're just going to do the best they can for the person that's in front of them. So, anybody got any questions? If you have, please put them in the Q&A, because we will have a little bit of time at the end, but we are overrunning slightly, and I apologise for that. I'm going to stop my share and hand back to Asha now.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm just going to share my screen up here. And here's something that we get asked a reasonable amount. How can you tell if your child is using drugs? So Ruth has talked very much about the kind of preemptive stuff and helping friends and things like that, saying safe strategies from that side of things. But of course, as parents and carers, you may well have this question. So how can you tell? Well, they might tell you. Someone else might tell you. You do need to be a little bit cautious about that, because everybody's motivation is not always pure. So you do need to be a little bit careful, but equally it's not something to disregard. You may see the effects or after effects. So that's all of the stuff that I was talking about earlier. And you may find drugs. You noticed I showed you lots of pictures of drugs or paraphernalia. So that's all the kind of stuff that goes around drugs. So one of them, quite common, is these little bags. They may have pills or powders or the remnants of those things in them, and they are really very small. They're like the ones that you get spare buttons with clothing. This is a charger or a cracker used to get nitrous oxide out of those little canisters and into balloons. It looks a little bit like an inhaler to my pharmacist eyes. There's a lot of things that go alongside cannabis. Not always, of course, but there can be. So containers that keep it in the dark to protect it from deteriorating in the light, grinders, inhalation devices, and so on. If you come across little things, slips of paper that look like transfers or stickers, they could be LSD tabs, and vaping devices. Well, the range of them is quite frankly astonishing, from the kind of disposable ones that just almost look like a USB stick to things that are quite complicated, but also some of them do look like everyday objects as well. So it's really about keeping your eyes out for anything that looks unfamiliar or unusual. It's also worth remembering that there are different phases of drug use, because it's very easy to jump to that, oh my goodness, my child is on drugs, they're addicted, but actually that is quite unusual for young people. Far more common is this very occasional or quite experimental use, where really it's one among lots of different things that they do, almost like a hobby that they're trying. If that hobby becomes more frequent and other hobbies start to fall by the wayside, we would consider that regular use. And they will normally be able to do most things that they do in their lives, but their social and personal functioning can start to decrease. You might notice things just start to fray a little bit around the edges. Now, the point at which we've got dependence and addiction, everything else really has fallen by the wayside. The only focus really of their life is the substance related activity. And while they might talk about stopping or reducing the use, in reality, that is incredibly challenging. And they can get stuck in cycles of craving and withdrawal, and then they cave with that and so on. But this is very unusual for young people. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but it is very rare. Now, some signs that you could look out for in terms of how they can manifest in lots of different ways. Now, some of them are around how they are socially. It could be that they change their friendship group, maybe they're associating with people who use drugs. It can also be in terms of their kind of financial situation, multiple phones, more money, less money. Maybe you're overhearing some drug-related conversations, or you notice things on their socials. Any of these things can be a sign of other stuff. Teenagers do change their friendship groups. They do sometimes have more money or less money. Sometimes their phone calls can be really odd to our ears. So it's about putting together a picture as opposed to one thing being a definite tell. There can be changes in how they are physically. The eyes are quite a common kind of thing that people think that they'll have dilated pupils, but actually sometimes their eyes may be red or streamy. They can change in terms of their weight or build. They may not be looking after themselves as they would do normally. Maybe their appearance has changed, or they seem to be neglecting themselves. And actually, you might notice unusual smells, maybe on them, but maybe when you're doing the laundry. And of course, there can be changes in their behaviour. And some of these may manifest at home, but some of them you may actually hear secondhand from the school. So it's really important to maintain that good relationship with the school, because sometimes their academic performance might drop, they might become more disruptive or particularly kind of lethargic in classes, particularly after weekends or events. Maybe they're not going as much as you think. So there's a whole range of things there. And as I say, it's about putting together a picture. Now, the conversation that you have with your child, if you suspect or know they're using drugs, is a little bit different to those preemptive conversations that Ruth was describing. So, of course, it's incredibly important to check the basis of your suspicions. And if there's more than one of you parenting, you need to be on the same side with this. You need to act as a team. And very fundamentally, you need to ask your child about it. Remember all of those reasons that Ruth was talking about earlier in terms of why people are using stuff. Some of it is around mental health needs, really struggling with stuff, and it can be a symptom rather than the main thing. So in terms of our interviews with teens, some of the tips that they pass on are: it's really important to listen without interrupting, ask questions, show empathy, and try and be understanding rather than judgmental. Equally, you cannot force them to open up, but you are demonstrating to them that you're in the right place and you're available to them. So if they're not ready, then hopefully they will feel that they can come back because you've laid the groundwork. Now, here's a really good one, I think, because this is something around just kind of really emphasizing to your child that no matter what's going on for them, you would rather know, because then it means that you can help them. and just kind of really building that open kind of channels of communication can just be so potent. And they might never use it, but equally they might. So it's definitely one to think about. Now, if they are continuing to use substances, it's really important to talk about harm reduction. Ruth talked earlier about the importance of not normalising things, and I did too, around alcohol. But if they are actually using stuff, talking about harm reduction is incredibly important in terms of their health. Harm reduction does differ for different substances, by the way. So if that is going on, it is something that you need to check. Ruth touched on it when she was talking about food. Important to eat before you're going out drinking. Not so important to eat if you're using something like ketamine, which is quite likely to make you vomit. So if you have eaten recently, that presents a choking risk. You need to kind of get into the understanding of that individual substance. Now, if your child is using drugs, it is a hard thing. So please do talk to others. This isn't something that you need to kind of front out on your own. And please, if it all goes wrong, please don't give up. It really, really matters. Get some support. There are organisations set up for those around those using drugs, AdFam and DrugFam. All of these will be on that leaflet that you can access afterwards. And professional help can be just the turning point for some people. We all learned during lockdown that actually cutting our own hair probably was not the greatest idea. Actually, there are people who are trained to do these things. And this is true with lots of things. So if you're struggling, do try and get professional help. The GP is a really good starting point. Sometimes that doesn't feel appropriate for whatever reason. And you can find out about local services specifically for young people using the search facilities on the Frank website and also the NHS website. Sometimes it is easier for young people to talk to people who aren't their parents or carers. They don't have the emotional connection, so sometimes they can feel that they can be more honest. Lots of places you can go for more information and support. So Frank and Drug Science are really useful sites around individual substances and drug classes. And with the Frank website, certainly you can type in street names and it will come up with what it's most likely to be. It's not perfect, but it's something. And there's also lots of information about risks, why people do things, presentations, and also legal status of various different substances. For information about alcohol, the Drink Aware site is quite useful. And when it comes to harm reduction, the Scottish Crew website, there's quite a lot of stuff on there. For some of the softer stuff, things like dealing with peer pressure or mental health problems, Young Minds and The Mix have some really great stuff on there. And for parents, the Teen Tips website is a really good one to look at more generally. We are the Daniel Spargo MABS Foundation, and we have lots of information on our website, but also across our social media channels. Our one that we use particularly with parents is our Facebook channel, but we also do use Twitter and Instagram, so do give us a follow if you would like to. And we also scan all the news and stuff like that, so if you're interested to kind of keep abreast of what's going on, we've done that hard work for you. So I'm going to bring Ruth back just to see if there have been any questions. Have there, Ruth?
No, that we haven't got any questions in the Q&A, but if anybody's got one now that they'd like to put in there, then please do, because we're here to answer them. But as was said earlier, if you want to review this, if you want to get the recording from school, then and a question comes up, then just get in touch with us. Oh, there we are. Could you share the link for the loop, please?
Yeah, that's all going to be in the information leaflet that you can access afterwards. So yeah, absolutely, that will be there. Anything else? And Fab, thank you. Someone said, yay. It's always nice to know that you can hear us. It's kind of weird talking into the abyss like this. Something that I just want to really quickly pick up on is when Ruth mentioned that really tricky question that kids can ask their parents and their carers about, have you ever done anything? And it's a really hard one. And I think it's really important to contextualize, if you are answering that question, contextualize what you're talking about, because sometimes it might be that, yes, you tried some stuff at university or when you were a bit older, but do talk about how people were older then and drugs were different. But also don't ignore those questions, because it shows that they're curious and they're interested to know what you think as well. And so they are really good opportunities. They're just opening the door a little crack, which sometimes, as the mother of teenagers myself, sometimes, you know, those moments are just golden, aren't they? So it's definitely worth kind of capitalizing on that. Has something else come in?
Another one coming, yes. My son knows a friend taking drugs and doesn't know how to help him in the right direction, to go in the right direction, sorry. So yeah,
It's a really tough one, I think. Something that you could do is maybe mention, oh, my parent went along to a workshop yesterday. They said it was really interesting. There's loads of websites out there that have got really sensible information about drugs. So it's, you know, it's really important to be informed, and maybe just flag up some of those, maybe harm reduction ones in particular, like the Scottish Crew site. So maybe that's a way in. Just like us adults need to take and make opportunities, it's the same for peers. So maybe that's a way in for them. It's really hard, but also if they trust an adult at school, maybe that's a way in. Talk to a teacher or a staff member who can then talk to that individual. But it is a hard one in terms of balancing, you know, you don't want to feel like you're passing on them, I think. So
it is really important just to try and help the child to find somebody that, you know, your child to find somebody that they can talk to about it, and you know, whether that's you or whether it's somebody at the youth club or whatever. But yes, if they can, and then they can, because otherwise they feel the responsibility very heavily, and it's not, you know, that's not helpful necessarily for your child, because you don't want them feeling guilty about what their friends are doing. So yeah.
So I think
that's
Anna wanted to come in maybe on that one. Did you want to say something from the school perspective? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say that obviously I'm part of the safeguarding team. There are 8 of us at Carrington School who are part of that team and can be found on our website. If anyone has any concerns about you know, their own child, or obviously other students, particularly those that attend our school or other schools, because we do have links with them, then, you know, we're happy to begin that process of the conversation. If, you know, you're finding that difficult to do as a parent, or the friend of you know, the parents as well. So please do contact us, because we can help, and we can make sure that we make referrals to the right agencies to get that child, that student, the right kind of support that they need.
Thank you. I mean, and I think that's also something to bear in mind. Someone has said that it can feel like the police aren't interested. You know, if you report stuff, you see it's a group of school kids. If you do know what school they're at, you could also contact the school and mention that, because that is something that the school will certainly take very seriously. And you know, not quite make an intervention, but certainly talk to those students. It doesn't always have to be about, I suppose, the stick. It can be also about support, and what's going on for them, and, you know, that kind of thing as well. And often there'll be maybe 1 or 2 people who are kind of quite in it, and there's a lot of kind of noise around it, and other people getting swept up and along with things, and that can be quite a difficult place to be in for those individuals. And actually it can be a bit of a relief when something does happen. So maybe that's something you can do. Obviously we can't speak for what the police do or don't do. Okay, well, I think we haven't got any more questions, so thank you very much for kind of interjecting there. That's really helpful to know that from the school. And Ruth's going to disappear. I've just got one more slide that I'm going to show, and then you can all be on your way. So let me just bring this back up. So Ruth is going to put a link into the chat that you can click on, and then it will just open. If you're on a laptop or a tablet, it will just open in your browser separately. You don't have to look at it now. I'm sure you want to go and have your dinner or whatever you're doing. Carry on with your evening, put children to bed. But you can leave that open, and then you can access it at a different time. Or there's also a QR code that you can just scan on your phone or tablet here as well. And you can get lots of things from that. It will take you to a designated site for parent workshops on our website, where you can get that information leaflet that we've talked about a few times. And there's some key slides on there, all of those websites with clickable links and all of that kind of stuff. But also let us know what you thought. There is a survey on there, and we do change things based on the feedback that we get, so please do let us know. And also, if you want to stay in touch with us, please do. We send out newsletters, not loads. I think it's like twice a year or once a term or something like this, really not very much.
Asha, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I just need to find that link because it's not where it normally is, so just give me a minute and I'll be there.
Okay, no problem. So Ruth is definitely on it, don't worry. You can also buy Fiona's best-selling book for parents called I Wish I'd Known, which there's so much stuff that we always want to put into parent workshops, but of course we're limited on time, and so Fiona wrote this amazing book that does go into a lot more detail about Dan's story, but also about different subjects and different substances and different topics around drugs, decision making, peer pressure, teenage brain development, all of that kind of stuff, addiction. So if you want to purchase that, then you can do that through our website, and all of the money does go to the foundation to support the work that we do, because we are a charity. We do everything on a shoestring, but we do have expenses as well that we need to cover. And she's actually got another book coming out later this year about a kind of conversations with teenagers, and I've just got a picture of the cover there for you. What else can you get on that link? You can also see those parent videos that I talked about before, access our newsletter, and you can, if you would like, and we'd be very gratefully received, is make a donation. And you can also do that through that text number that's there. That's it really. So from me and from Ruth and from the school, thank you very much for spending this time with us. We really hope that you found it useful, and it's given you food for thought and hopefully fueled those conversations that I'm sure you want to have with your teenagers, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. The foundation was set up really based on what is every parent's worst nightmare, but that is unusual. But there are lots of things that happen that could be prevented. So you've done an amazing thing by coming along tonight and being open to all of this. So good luck with it all. Go well. And thank you once more for coming.